October 12, 1944, 7:10 p.m. Polk County Library, North Carolina. Rain taps the tin awning as a truck grinds to a stop. A line of female German POWs steps down, jaws set for fields and shovels. Inside, the lights glow warm. A librarian, grey cardigan, name penciled on a circulation card, slides open the door, sets out chipped cups and says, "You'll start with English tonight." Steam lifts from the tea. Hard labor becomes hard consonants. Th, R, W. Books thud onto oak tables. Wary faces tilt toward pages. They were prepared for chains. Instead, they're handed verbs and mercy. I remember how the room inhaled when the door opened fully. A single breath shared by townspeople and prisoners before anyone remembered what to do with their hands. I stepped to the table and read out pairs the way you might call teams at a pie supper. Mrs. Whitlow with the seamstress in the brown kerchief. Ruth Ann with the red-cheeked farm girl with chin tucked. Mr. Cates with the older woman whose shoulders carried a factory floor. The guard settled beside the radiator while the kettle began its low, patient song. We passed chipped cups, added lemon where there was no sugar, and wrote the evening's first lesson on the slate. The alphabet, printed wide enough that even the shyest could trace it with a finger. Hospitality met grammar at the threshold, and together they negotiated an armistice none of us imagined that morning. I chalked A and heard chairs scrape as the pairs leaned close. I chalked B and smelled wool damp from the rain. I chalked C, and the seamstress whispered the letter like a prayer trying on. The drill kept a mountain rhythm, steady, spare, unhurried. When we reached the thicket of consonants, I showed my tongue behind my teeth and said thy, and a dozen careful mouths tested a sound their language handled differently. Air moved over the tables as if we had all leaned out a window together. Ruth Ann laughed softly at her partner's theatrical R, then apologized, and the apology turned into a true R, rounder than the first and suddenly owned. Between lines we refilled the kettle and traded small barter. A new pencil for the farm girl's apple cake recipe, written haltingly on a returned book slip. A longer eraser in exchange for the older woman's trick for loosening a stuck zipper. I kept attendance on cards lifted from a retired shelf, and each name I sounded out with its owner, until we agreed on a spelling that honored her and served our role. The guard relaxed when he realized he was not needed. The room was obeying something gentler. Attention paid, respect offered, sound shaped and handed back. Expectation that America would answer with chains met reality in a library where heat pipes clicked and windows rattled and nobody raised a voice. We moved from letters to the smallest of bridges, is, are, am. I wrote I am and tapped my chest, then you are, and offered a palm toward the seamstress, then she is, and the gee. Room, pleased by the grammar of recognition, tried the pattern on each pair in turn. A miracle slipped past anyone outside. We were saying who we were without uniforms doing the talking. By the time the clock's hand climbed another notch, chalk dust had settled into our cuffs. Tea rings had bloomed on blotters, and the first truth of the night had been learned on both sides of the tables. Work could remain hard without being cruel, and language, even at its simplest, could shoulder a load meant for fists. I keep the card in the top drawer where the paperclips live, its edges softened by thumbs, the graphite line running neat as a fence. Started with the and R, very brave. I wrote it between kettle refills, pressing the point carefully so it would not gouge the paper, because what happened at those tables wanted witness without fanfare. The note is nothing to anyone who has never taught a sound, but to me it records the moment fear and pride met at the mouth and tried to share a seat. I saw it first in the seamstress, her jaw set as if bracing for a blow, then loosening when the thin hiss of thief slid past without breaking her. I saw it again in the older woman, rolling R like a millstone until it caught and purred. I did not write their names beside the sentence because the sentence belonged to everyone that night, including us. Ruth Ann's hand trembled slightly as she moved from tea to slate. Mr. Cates coughed into his sleeve to hide a smile. The guard pretended to read a notice and failed. I tucked the card back only after the room had exhaled together, and the exhale sounded like chairs scooting and pencils scraping and a few small laughs that did not quite trust themselves yet. The town had prepared for work details and watch rotations. We had practiced being stern, practiced being safe, practiced not saying too much. Nobody practiced what to do when a stranger earned a sound and looked up brighter for it. The penciled line keeps asking me a question no ledger can tabulate. Who is being schooled harder here? The students or the town that offers letters with its suspicions? I know how easily charity can turn into performance, so I watch for vanity the way you watch for sparks in a hayloft. On the walk home, men at the filling station weighed mercy as if it were a sack of feed, and I carried the card like a counterweight in my pocket. In the morning, the grocer slipped me 2 lemons at ration price and said nothing. In the afternoon, the churchwomen argued whether we should move to verbs. By evening, Mrs. Whitlow brought her best eraser tied with twine as if it were a pie. Each errand answered the card without reading it. When the women returned, I laid the card on the table and read the sentence aloud in a voice that tried not to tremble, then turned it over and left the back blank on purpose, because the question still stands. If courage is measured in inches of tongue and teeth, how many inches belong to the rest of us? I began a quiet ledger beneath that line, not of grades but of small proofs. A looser jaw, a quicker smile, a hand that reached for a second cup. The line sharpened me too, sanding off impatience until attention felt like duty, and duty began to feel tender. The ledger card sits small on my desk, and yet around it the county stretches like a map of want. Gasoline arriving in dribbles, thread scarce as patience, coffee a rumor traded after church from hand to hand. We lined our windows with blackout curtains stitched from old flour sacks, taped X's across glass so the shards would behave if the worst came, and learned the sound of distant freight as intimately as hymns. Coal eastbound, timber westbound, troops always in between. Our mountains sluicing the nation's war like a narrow throat. Still, on the shelf nearest the stove, we kept a dented kettle polished by use, and beside it a crate of textbooks salvaged from a closed school, dog-eared and underlined by children who now wrote to fathers in Europe and uncles in the Pacific. In the mornings, the butcher weighed fat with a priest's gravity, and in the evenings I measured tea leaves, like a jeweler counting stones, because hospitality had been promoted to strategy, and strategy to identity. This is who we mean to be, even when the coupons run out. Mrs. Whitlow snipped ration stamps with a thrift that could shame a banker, then straightened the spines of donated dictionaries as if mending them might set our own backs right. Mr. Cates turned off porch lights at 9 sharp and still found his way to the library by the glow of a pocket torch, the beam thin as a sewing needle but sufficient to thread him through the dark. The heater clanged, the pipes groaned, and the room gathered around the whistle of water like a town around a depot, waiting not for a train this time, but for the slow arrival of syllables. Outside, posters instructed us to keep our mouths shut for security, while inside we opened them to shape the R for strangers in grey coats who held their cups with both hands. The war machine rumbled past in boxcars and headlines, vast and indifferent, but our rebellion was measured in the diameter of cups and the thickness of steam, in the way a volunteer set a saucer with 2 fingers to keep it from clattering, in the way the guard, more careful than he knew, rested his rifle against the radiator to warm the metal so it would not sting his palm. We rationed sugar, but overspent on attention, counted coupons, but lost track of the minutes we spent waiting for a shy mouth to trust a vowel. The blackout drills taught us to move quietly, and we imported that quiet into teaching until the tables seemed to hum with a power that required no generator. When storms pressed their hands against the roof, we moved the women closer to the stove and read aloud, voices soft but steady, proof that small cups can stand against great noise, and that a kettle's whistle, trivial as a sparrow, can still be heard above the grind of distant engines if a room chooses to listen together. We did not invent this from sentiment alone. The rules themselves left a door ajar, and we simply propped it open with a chair and a kettle, while the guard kept his post by the radiator, signing the ledger as I did, two hands sharing a bureaucracy that, for once, favored gentleness. Classes permitted under supervision, cultural materials allowed if they did not tilt to propaganda, instruction conducted by civilians so long as uniforms remained visible, and the chain of custody, as they called it, was never broken. I learned the phrasing from a mimeographed circular the camp lieutenant slid across our desk with a pencil tapping the margins, and I underlined the dullest words with the most relief. May, shall, authorized. Strange little bridges across a river, otherwise swollen with no. The churches and clubs stepped through those verbs as if they were stepping stones. The Methodists offering a box of hymnals with the war pages pasted over. The Baptists sending a deacon to pour coffee when tea ran thin. The Ladies' Aid stitching cloth covers for dictionaries so the cracked spines would not discourage new readers. The Rotary man producing a typewriter ribbon from a drawer nobody knew he had, and the high school principal, moonlighting as a referee for our grammar quarrels, delivering spare slates and chalk as if he were officiating a game whose rules kept us honest and out of trouble. Everything happened within sight of the sergeant, who never sat but learned to lean, his shoulder finding the same spot on the door jamb each night, and when he shifted, you could hear the wood remember him, a small sound of continuity that reassured even those who distrusted the whole enterprise. Nothing escaped the paperwork the lieutenant loved. Sign-in sheets, counts, initials in the right corner. But he found no offense in the shape of a vowel, and privately admitted he trusted tables more when pencils were busy above them. When questions came from town, was this allowed? Was this wise? Was this soft? I could answer without manufacturing virtue, pointing to the language that governed even our kindness. Supervised instruction, humane occupation, constructive use of hours, phrasing as dull as a cloudy noon, and just as necessary to keep the glare of argument down. More than once I watched skepticism bend its head over a clause and come up merely cautious instead of hostile, which was victory enough to keep the kettle on. The women understood the boundary as clearly as we did, glancing at the doorway where a boot shifted or a throat cleared, and they learned a second ritual alongside the letters, pausing when the guard took a step, continuing when he settled, a choreography that made the room safe, not by forgetting the war, but by acknowledging it and then working anyway. It helped that the minister's wife, who could quiet a picnic with the raise of an eyebrow, sat at the center table and turned every uncertainty into a practical question. How many cups? What time tomorrow can we borrow your lamp? And because the answers were countable, the doubts dwindled. Within that frame, narrow and watchful, we found enough room for a pronoun to belong to someone, for a verb to lift its head, for a mouth to risk a new sound without fearing it would be mistaken for defiance. We eased out of the safety of labels, cup, book, stove, window, and into the thin air where words had to hold more than shape, where we asked them to carry feeling without spilling it, and I laid out a stack of postcards salvaged from the county fair, blank on one side, Ferris wheel fading on the other, and said we would try a letter home, short as a breath, simple as a road sign. No boasting, no politics, No promises we could not keep. Just the kind of truth a mouth can stand to say. The room shifted like a wagon finding a rut, uncertain but moving, and pencils hovered above the first line as if ink might burn. We started together. Dear. And I wrote it on the slate and let the vowels unspool from us. Then a name, any name that lived in a heart. And we stalled there, not because the sounds were hard, but because every letter was a door, and you could hear the hinges complain. The seamstress tested mutter against mother under her breath, the way you test a bridge board with your toe, and her lips thinned to a seam when the new word asked her to come across without a hand to hold. So I said we could borrow the German where needed, that a letter's first duty was to tell the truth of who was speaking, not to please a dictionary. And still the pencil did not move. The kettle popped and settled. The guard cleared his throat for the first time that hour. Mr. Cates shifted his chair to break the spell, and the spell only deepened until silence pressed against our ears like altitude, a little pain that lets you know where you are. Finally, Ruth Ann touched her partner's wrist and traced mother in the air with her finger, not on the page, but hovering just above it as though she were blessing a place before stepping into it. And the older woman beside them steadied her own hand with the other and wrote quickly, the way you pull a splinter, the word out before you can cry. One by one the lines began to appear, halting, uneven, courageous as first steps. I am well. It is cold, but we have tea. I am learning the hard sounds. There is a lady who mends books. The mountains look like home when the fog comes. I moved among the tables, helping a vowel find its seat, adjusting a th, where an f kept sneaking in. But mostly I kept my voice low so the quiet could do its work, because quiet had become the room's chief ally and sternest teacher, making us all pay for every inch we tried to cross. When the seamstress finally set her pencil to paper, her first line was 2 words, Dear Mother, and she stopped again, as if the address itself had opened a window and the cold had rushed in, and then, in a kind of surrender that looked like strength, she wrote 3 more. I am learning, and I nodded and said yes to the sentence and to the larger thing that sentence was building toward, a bridge made of small boards, laid steady, over water neither of us could measure. By the time we put the cards in a stack to be checked for the rules, the silence had softened from iron to wool, not because grief had gone, but because we had given it a place to sit that was not the throat. They told us later, in halting, embarrassed words, that they had braced for dogs and fists, for cold floors and barked commands. We had braced just as privately for sabotage, hard eyes, and rules mocked to our faces. Yet night after night, the room kept sanding those edges until the shape left behind surprised all of us, despite everything we had assumed. Our reserve did most of the work at first, like water wearing stone. We kept our voices low, our promises small, the kettle steady, and they learned that predictability is shelter. They flinched when a chair scraped, and then they did not. They watched the guard's hands, and then they watched the chalk instead. They held their cups like shields and then like cups. I caught myself revising my own story, the one where principle stands bristling and alone. It turned out principle sits better than it stands, and that methodical kindness is not the opposite of discipline, but a version that bothers to count to 10. When a new group came in, grim-mouthed, the older woman from the first night lifted her chin toward the stove and said one English word she had earned, tea. I watched the tension crack along hairline seams as steam curled up and softened concrete ideas that had been carried for years. The dissonance made a sound you could almost hear, a clatter of inherited fear meeting the hush of ordinary procedure. Outside, talk stayed hard. The filling station men drew maps in dust with the tips of their boots and said, charity was a leak in a wartime roof. At home, I felt the old training twitch my shoulders when the radio mentioned prison camps elsewhere. But inside the library, the news dissolved into the small mathematics of trust. 1 cup, plus 1 name, plus 1 sound held correctly. And the sum kept coming up human. Some nights, the women tried on our customs as if testing borrowed coats, a please too bright around the edges, a thank you delivered like a salute, the way a hymn tune hummed under breath, as though music might be a neutral country. We tried on theirs too, without admitting it. The crispness with which they stacked chairs, the pride they took in small accuracies, the way they straightened each other's collars before stepping back into the dark. Every exchange pushed against both of our expectations until they felt hollow when tapped, like gourds that have been dried for rattles. The engine of the week was that hollow sound, that shake in the chest when a prejudice loses. Ballast. It powered the room more surely than the radiator, and it kept us all a little awake even after the door clicked shut. By the time I realized my shoulders were no longer braced, I also realized I had stopped waiting for them to fail a test I had not the right to set. When I walked home under the blackout curtains we called the sky, I felt the old story pad along beside me, still loyal, still useful for certain dangers, but no longer in charge. A newer one kept pace on the other side, quieter, harder to repeat to a crowd, and truer in the mouth. The same rail line that carried the women to us, groaned at dawn with coal cars and clattered by night with troop transports, its steel voice echoing off the Blue Ridge slopes like a reminder of scale, how very small our chipped cups were beside the machinery of war. The trains did not slow as they passed the camp, and when the wind was right, their whistles slipped through the rafters of the library, mingling with steam rising from our kettle. A man could stand by the tracks and watch an entire war pass in under 2 minutes. Tanks tarped on flatbeds, boxcars stenciled with cities far away, canvas-covered men drowsing beneath rifles. But in our room, an hour might be spent coaxing a single vowel into place. The contrast held us taut. I could hand a woman a dictionary older than she was and still feel the ground quiver underfoot from an engine miles away. And that engine reminded me that elsewhere, civility was not being rationed. It was being stripped, starved, burned out. But here, under the low lights, we poured hot water over faded leaves, passed a tin of crackers with care, and corrected a consonant with the same attention one might give a wound. There was no illusion that we could stop the trains, but we could insist, with stubborn frequency, that manners mattered, even, or especially, when the world shouted otherwise. The chipped cups we used were borrowed from the church basement, mismatched and nicked, each with a hairline fracture that hadn't yet reached the lip. I counted them each night after the women left, not because I thought they would steal one, though some in town worried they might, but because those cups stood for a ceremony we had not known we needed until we saw it working. Steam rose from them like a flag too quiet to salute. The women took them in both hands at first, as if bracing for something stronger, and only later began to cradle them loosely, confident the contents would not burn. Meanwhile, out beyond the last pine trees, freights moved in darkness, bearing materials measured in tons, destinations marked in code, schedules that left no room for detours or doubt. But inside the library, a woman who had once expected boots and barked orders now paused to wipe her cup's rim with her sleeve and say, "Please," for another pour. If the war ran on fuel, this room ran on form. The repetition of asking, the offering of a seat, the correction that came with a pencil instead of a fist. I once read that locomotives prefer straight tracks and hate the soft ground of Appalachia. But we, perhaps because of our crooked roads and yielding hills, had learned to make room for something less efficient and more human. Against the roar of iron and the ash of coal, we offered the hiss of water and the scrape of chalk. And somehow, in that lopsided contest, the ledger showed gains we could not ship or shelve, but knew were real just the same. At the Sinclair station just past the courthouse, where the men gathered evenings like iron filings to a magnet, jackets stiff with sawdust and lard, knuckles branded with work, a conversation found its groove in the ruts of suspicion. "Mercy fattens the foe," said one, drawing it out like he'd practiced in the mirror. Another spat near the tire rack and muttered that teaching Germans to read was like giving a fox the key to the henhouse. Laughter cracked and echoed off the bay walls, but not everyone laughed. Mr. Cates told me later he had been there, listening from the pump, and that the silence after those remarks was longer than expected, full of men wondering whether they agreed or just hadn't yet found the words to object. I felt it at the grocer's too, in the slow way Mrs. Ellison rang me up, eyes tracing the ledger book in my satchel like it might bite. That night, I brought the thickest manila folder I had and laid it on the front table with purpose. Inside, camp permissions, county sign-offs, Geneva excerpts underlined in red. I added the sign-in sheet from the last 2 weeks and the list of vocabulary mastered. Concrete proof that nothing treasonous had passed these walls, only sounds, some still mispronounced. When Mrs. Whitlow arrived with her psalter, I asked her to read aloud the verse we'd used last Sunday when the seamstress struggled with love. 1 Corinthians, of course. Patience, kindness, the rest. It sounded different in a room where kindness had to justify itself. Then I read from the camp regulation aloud, slow as scripture. Instruction may be offered if conducted under guard, under civilian authority, and free from subversive material. The guard nodded from his usual place. He'd already initialed the logs himself. I followed the paper with policy, the policy with verse, and then let the papers rest in full view, open like a ledger God might keep. That night, the women were quieter, as if they too sensed a wind shift beyond the walls. But they came, and they tried, and they said thank you, with the careful rhythm of those who suspect the welcome might be rescinded. We served tea anyway. We corrected their verbs. We told the truth, which that week sounded like, yes, some people would rather see you break rocks. Yes, some believe kindness is a leak in the hull. Yes, we know. But here are the words. Try again. Mercy, I wrote on the board, and beside it, the German word. And then I waited. The room looked at me, like the wind might knock the whole table over. But then the seamstress raised her hand and repeated it, slow and thick. Merci, not perfect, but brave. I put a check mark on the sign-in sheet beside her name and moved on. It began with a hum, barely more than breath, while I was collecting slates at the back table. A sound so thin it could have been the radiator's moan, except it carried a tune, familiar as bread. At first I thought it was Ruth Ann, but she looked up too, eyes already searching for the source. It came from the seamstress, her lips parted around syllables she hadn't yet mastered, but the rhythm, there was no mistaking it. Amazing grace, carried in English across a German accent, slow, tentative, shaped more by memory than confidence. One by one, heads lifted. Nobody spoke. The guard's hand paused on his ledger. I caught Mr. Cates lowering his chalk mid-word. She kept going, each note almost crumbling but finding its footing at the last moment, like a child learning to walk on ice. She wasn't translating. She was borrowing, syllable by syllable, the hymn that had ended more than one town funeral and opened every church meeting since any of us could recall. And yet, from her mouth, it felt both new and old at once, as if the melody had tunneled under the ocean and come up gasping for breath in our room. The others watched, stunned into stillness, not by offense, but by recognition. Not long ago, they had expected we might use hymns to shame them, force-fed morality in place of meals. Instead, this was something else entirely, a reaching. When she faltered on the word wretch, Ruth Ann mouthed it for her, and the seamstress nodded, tried again, and made it through the line. The word did not sting. In fact, it softened all of us. Language, we realized then, was not a weapon to be confiscated, but a ladder, rickety, narrow, but pointed upward. The women saw it too. One whispered the German version beneath the English, matching beat for beat. I stepped forward, afraid to disrupt the moment, but unwilling to let it pass without anchoring it. "Would you like the words?" I asked, holding out a hymnal. But she shook her head and kept going, each line steadier than the last. By the second verse, the town was no longer just listening. We were remembering. Funerals, campfires, tent meetings, baptisms in cold creeks where voices carried better than reason ever could. I thought of the men at the filling station, all certainty and gravel, and wondered what they would do if they heard this. Not surrender, not manipulation, just a shared need set to music. The room exhaled when the song ended, not with applause, but a hush that seemed to ask permission to begin again. No one said anything for a while. The guard, still leaning, scratched something in his notes with a face I could not read. The tea steamed. The kettle whistled softly. And in that stillness, we all knew something had crossed over, something more vital than grammar, harder to measure than progress. We were not agreeing, but we were recognizing. That was enough. For now, that was everything. We did not argue. We recorded. The ledger on the library desk, its cloth spine fraying like a worn hem, held every evening's names, the lessons attempted, the materials used, and the initials of the guard who stood watch and drank his tea unsweetened. There were no flourishes, only tallies. The number of words translated, the vocabulary sets completed, how many postcards mailed under censor approval. I flipped to the most recent page and drew a line in red pencil under the seamstress's name. "Sang hymn," I wrote, and beside it, pronounced grace correctly. Across from the ledger, tacked to a corkboard, were clippings from the local paper. Librarians host language nights for camp women, printed small beside farm commodity prices and church bake sales. The articles were thin, cautious, too polite to be proud, but the facts were there: dates, times, numbers of attendees, full names of volunteers who had nothing to hide and everything to prove. I saved a note from the camp chaplain too, typed on a royal machine with sticky keys, its ribbon half spent. "I have observed a softening in attitude. Incidents reduced. Tone improved. Recommend continuation." I kept that one tucked behind the desk calendar, but I read it often. Mr. Cates brought in a box of returned workbooks from the high school. He'd marked the inside covers with initials to show they were now being reused under a different kind of test. We documented this transformation the way the army documented rations, not for flourish, but for audit. When opposition rose, as it still did at the barber shop and post office, we didn't counter with sentiment. We opened the folder. We showed the signed regulations, the Geneva clauses highlighted in yellow, the list of books approved by both church board and county review. We held up the hymnal the seamstress had borrowed. Pages dog-eared, margins penciled with English synonyms beside German lines. I made a new column in the ledger, notable effort, and began tracking moments that had no score but changed the room anyway. One evening, a woman drew a picture of her village on the back of a word list. Another time, a volunteer left her husband's war letter out by mistake, and instead of stealing it, the POW returned it folded with a single line underlined, "If we can be good, let us be good." We added that to the board, too. Evidence began to pile like cordwood, dense, ordinary, flammable if twisted, but warm when kept whole. The room became its own kind of archive. Every chipped cup another footnote, every mispronounced word a new citation in the argument that decency, sustained and written down, could hold its ground even against louder things. By the 10th week, we no longer whispered about whether this mattered. We had proof. Not a verdict, not a slogan, but pages enough to stand on, even if the ground shook. It was a Tuesday near the end of the month, the kind of evening when the wind spoke in rafters and the kettle needed refilling twice to keep spirits up. I remember it because Ruth Ann stood very still, her hand resting on the edge of the table where her student, a quiet woman named Ilsa, who had finally begun using English names for the days of the week, was sounding out a sentence that had no direct bearing on the lesson. "I was child with a red scarf," she said, slow but sure, and Ruth Ann, who usually corrected gently, didn't. She just looked at her. I saw something settle across Ruth Ann's face then, like a weight, arriving not all at once but in increments. And later, when we were stacking chairs, she told me what it was. "It isn't charity," she said. "It's not forgiveness either." I waited. She had her hands tucked into the sleeves of her cardigan, like she did when the truth felt large. "It's what we say we are," she continued, voice low. "This whole room, these books, that kettle, that's the country, isn't it? Not the one in posters, the one we claim to be when no one's watching." I didn't answer, because I felt the ground move a little under my shoes. We had come into this expecting to extend mercy like a favor, a loan against conscience or Christian duty. But what we'd built was no longer a handout. It was a statement. Every word we offered, every correction given and received without shame, every time we handed over a pencil instead of suspicion, we were staking a flag, not against an enemy, but for ourselves. Not perfection, just proof of concept. We didn't let the women speak propaganda, but we taught them to say, "I am," and "I was," and "I hope." And those verbs, unadorned, made more sense to me than any speech I'd ever heard on a courthouse step. I thought of the ledger again, of the tallies and the hymn lines and the returned postcards signed simply with initials and rain-streaked stamps. Not one of them said freedom outright, but every one of them asked for it in another way. The contradiction sat bare and luminous. We were teaching literacy under armed guard, offering grace with ration stamps, asserting a moral identity, while trains nearby carried men to war. But in that contradiction, we found clarity. Not that we were flawless, but that we were trying deliberately against gravity and resentment to live up to the language we claimed as ours. And language, as I had learned from these nights, does not lie easily. You must work for it, earn its shapes, hold it with both hands until it softens. I looked at Ruth Ann, who was adjusting the hem of a torn workbook cover, and saw in her not a volunteer, but a citizen practicing what that meant, by example, not declaration. And it was then I understood. What we were doing in that room was not a kindness. It was a defense, a quiet, daily act of patriotism spelled out one syllable at a time. It began to show in places we hadn't expected, like cracks running in reverse, closing instead of widening. At the camp gate, the guards no longer gripped their rifles as tight. The women stepped down from trucks with fewer glances over their shoulders. The count went faster. The paperwork matched without incident. One sergeant told me, not without irony, that the detail crews finished wood stacking 20 minutes early 3 days in a row, and with their boots laced this time. It wasn't discipline alone. It was a shift in tone. The women had begun asking questions in English before being told. Where should we start? How long do we have? Simple things, but volunteered freely. And the letters, those told the truth loudest. The censor reports, dry as cornmeal, noted a change. Fewer coded phrases, fewer idealized phrases about life in camp, fewer invocations of glory or furor or fatherland. Instead, we read old books. I am learning to spell stove. There is a girl here who is kind to me. One letter ended with, I wish I could write more clearly. And the censor, a school teacher on weekdays, wrote, approved, in blue ink, and underlined it twice, not because the words were polished, but because they were plain. Honesty, we discovered, was a teachable trait, but only once shame had loosened its grip. Even the guards noticed. One remarked to the camp chaplain that the women were less slippery with the truth, as if truth had become a substance that might be held without gloves. Back in the town, something shifted too. Volunteers who had once come out of obligation began arriving early. Tea was donated without being asked. One afternoon, Mr. Cates left a parcel at the library door. 10 fresh notebooks tied with string. No note, just his name penciled on the wrapping. Ruth Ann told me a churchwoman who'd sworn it was all a waste had begun practicing English pronunciation so she could better model vowels. Even the filling station quieted down. The grumbling didn't disappear, but it lost its volume. Respect had entered the room like a draft and refused to leave. The lesson plan expanded, past grammar, into things like writing thank you notes or describing weather. One woman wrote, "Today is fog, tomorrow is maybe rain. I don't mind. I have words now." That was the shift. What started as policy compliance, as Geneva justified civility, had rippled outward into something none of us could quite name, but all of us recognized. Mutual regard. Not agreement, not friendship, not yet, but a slower temper, a quicker courtesy, a trust earned syllable by syllable. I began to keep 2 ledgers, one for the official hours and pages read, another, smaller, tucked into my coat, for the moments that changed nothing measurable and everything else. That was where I recorded the day a POW asked how to write enough. I spelled it slowly, she copied it twice, and when she said, "Is this right?" I looked at the page and thought, yes, more right than you know. 9:12 p.m. The kettle gave its final hiss, not a whistle now, but the soft sigh of something spent. Its belly scraped clean of water and heat. The last pages were tucked back into workbooks, pencils aligned beside borrowed erasers, dictionaries stacked, not alphabetically but with care, the way you set stones atop a grave. Not to mourn, but to mark that something had been there, had mattered. The women rose without prompting. No clatter, just the hush of chairs drawn back in near-perfect unison. The guard, he who had once stood like a statue by the radiator, stepped forward and opened the door without word or flourish. One by one they passed under his arm, a procession not of captives, but of something quieter. Learners, perhaps. Worn coats, damp hems, hands clutching folders like rations. Some paused to meet his eye. Most simply mouthed the words they had earned, lips careful, uncertain, reverent. Thank you. Not always clear, not always fluent, but always meant. He nodded, the ledger under his arm forgotten. I stayed behind to count the cups, 12 again, and rinsed the last one beneath the tap, its handle warm from a final hand. Ruth Ann straightened the dictionary pile, then paused, fingers brushing a familiar edge. I saw her pull the circulation card from the top of the stack. The pencil mark still held, unfaded despite weeks of handling. Started with Eth and R, very brave. She set it gently in the drawer where it belonged, then closed it without sound. I remained a moment longer, watching the steam rise from the sink like the first lines of a letter we hadn't yet written. Outside, the night carried the hum of distant trains, boxcars loaded with iron and intention. But here, in the library's hush, only consonants remained, hard, imperfect, human. We had not softened the war, nor pretended to end it. We had simply taught its survivors, word by word, how to be understood. And in that room, among chipped cups and pencil shavings, that had been enough.